When appealing to objective morality in defense of belief in God, it is quite common to rely, implicitly or otherwise, on a false dichotomy between divine command theory and unbridled moral relativism. For the record, I completely share many theists' trepidation at the prospect and implications of moral relativism, but let me be equally clear about this. Divine command theory does not solve the problem and in fact quite arguably exacerbates it. But we may be getting ahead of ourselves. First, let's clarify what exactly we mean when we say objective morality, since my answer to the question of if it exists depends very much on how it's defined. In my experience, the various usages of the phrase objective morality can be at least roughly categorized into two broad definitions. First, objective morality may be a system of ethical standards that is empirically inherent to reality itself and to which the mental states of conscious organisms are ultimately irrelevant. Under this definition, morality is not unlike the laws of physics, perhaps differing only in the ability of conscious agents with free will to violate it. Murder is physically possible, but with apologies to Elphaba, defying gravity is not. Second, objective morality may be a system of ethical standards by which cross-cultural judgments can be made without anyone being vulnerable to the charge of cultural imperialism. Basically, it's a kind of morality that allows us to reliably distinguish legitimate moral outrage from mere culture shock, and to defend moral assessments with something besides the point of the imperialist sword. To avoid this equivocation, I think we should start referring to the second definition as universal morality, thus clearly distinguishing it from the first definition. With that distinction in mind, my answer to the question of whether objective morality exists becomes quite simple. No. Objective morality does not exist. However, I believe a strong case can be made for the existence of universal morality. Sam Harris argues that morality is, at its core, all about the well-being of conscious creatures. I've paraphrased and somewhat expanded that basic formulation to be a bit more explicit and comprehensive, but it's basically the same idea. All moral reasoning is ultimately traceable to a single foundational axiom, which I'll call the fundamental axiom of universal morality, or FOM, of which the most complete statement may be as follows. We ought to do that which has the net effect of increasing the well-being and/or decreasing the suffering of sentient entities. Conversely, we ought not to do that which has the net effect of decreasing the well-being and/or increasing the suffering of sentient entities. This axiom can alternatively be put in the form of definitions for the words good, or right, and bad, or wrong. However you put it, I don't think the FOM is, in its essence, anything new. I think it's the best attempt yet to clearly and explicitly articulate what we all mean when we use moral terms, even if only implicitly. I believe that all sentient beings and all cultures take the FOM as their underlying ethical foundation, even if other premises can cause disagreement on particular issues as we proceed from that shared foundation and derive specific moral conclusions. The FOM is not objective, but in its sheer universality, it may as well be for all practical purposes. Plus, the hard fact is that no realm of discourse, moral or otherwise, can ever be truly self-contained in the way that many theists seem to want. If you follow the chain of premises and peel back the layers of reasoning far enough, you will inevitably come to a kind of epistemological singularity, a single assumption or hopefully small set of assumptions that cannot itself be coherently justified. That's just a hard fact of life, and for any presuppositionalists out there, listen up. God does absolutely nothing to change that. But I digress. The annoying nothing burger that is presuppositionalism will probably be a topic for a whole other video. Back to morality. At this point, in defense of God-based morality, you might be thinking something to the effect of, that's still not good enough. However universal the FOM may be, it's still just an opinion. But with God, we actually have an objective standard. If you are indeed thinking anything like that, let's take a deeper look. You may be tempted to say that honesty is good because God commands us to be honest, or perhaps because God's nature is one of honesty. In other words, God's will and/or nature entails honesty, so therefore, we ought to be honest. But by itself, this is a non sequitur. The conclusion doesn't follow from the premise. There's a missing premise here. I suppose it's an easy one for many people to take for granted, but this is philosophy. We'll have none of that here. There we go. Now we have a valid argument, with a conclusion that follows necessarily from its premises. But notice what we had to do to get there. Premise 1 is a descriptive statement, presumably one of fact from the proponent's perspective. Premise 2, on the other hand, is a prescriptive statement of value, but that's really the only way to make this argument work. To get the ought in the conclusion, we need an ought in one of the premises. In fact, the crucial hidden premise is basically the foundational claim of divine command theory. This means that an idea which essentially claims to succeed at deriving an ought from an is actually depends on assuming an ought. And here's the kicker. The central premise of the DCT is no less subjective, no less of a brute assumption, than the FOM. You can ask why we ought to value well-being and curtail suffering, but I can just as easily ask why we ought to act in accordance with God's will and/or nature. So the FOM is indeed ultimately subjective, but so too is the DCT, so pointing that out does us absolutely no good in adjudicating between the two moral axioms. But even this stalemate is a best-case scenario for divine command. Until now, I've been granting, for the sake of argument, that the two moral axioms on the table are equally basic, but I have my doubts about that too. To see why, indulge me in a brief thought experiment, if you will. Let's say you've convinced me that God is real and that everything you believe about His nature and His will is true. Now, suppose I ask you one simple question. Why should I care? God's will and/or nature may entail honesty, but why should that compel me personally to be honest? Why should I necessarily seek to emulate and/or obey God to the best of my ability? I strongly suspect that you'll find it impossible to come up with a reason which doesn't ultimately reduce to some form of divinely orchestrated reward and/or punishment, whether you think it will come in this life, the next, or both. But what is divine reward, if not a form of well-being? What is divine punishment, if not a form of suffering? What am I, or rather, what is my soul, if not a sentient entity? Quite arguably, God's will and/or nature can only ever be compelling for us mortals if we first take the FOM on board. For example, wanting to save me from hellfire only makes sense if you presuppose that it's a bad thing for a sentient entity like me to suffer, as I surely would in such an afterlife. So actually, it seems that the FOM is the only true axiom on the table, with divine command being a subsequent derivation based on additional descriptive premises. Even if I were to accept the DCT, then, it would still be reducible to the FOM. It's almost as if, dare I say it, a deist has to borrow from my atheist worldview in order to properly ground his or her morality. It gets even worse for divine command theory when you realize that it often seems much easier to get people to agree on which entities are sentient and what causes their well-being versus their suffering than it is to get them to agree on who God is. The one thing that appears to be common to all versions of God, though, is His persistent refusal to be put under the same proverbial microscope that we can easily use to determine the sentience of an organism and its mental state. But we'll open that can of worms in another video, and you've listened to my nerdy musings long enough. For now, just remember this, you can't get an ought from an is, even if the is happens to be about God. Thanks for watching.